Homeless man who finds and returns $40,000 gets an even bigger reward. They say one man's trash is another man's treasure, and in the case of Glenn James, that statement proves to be true. Except instead of trash, it was a large amount of cash that was accidentally misplaced by the owner. For even the richest of people, finding a huge chunk of change would be a big deal. For James, a homeless man, it was even more impactful. Placed in a tough position, James came with a plan for the money that's now inspiring people across the world. The United States' biggest cities are all fighting to solve the homelessness crisis, but more and more people keep ending up on the streets. Glenn James was just one of many who called sidewalks and alleyways his living room. James was homeless on the streets of Boston. A man in his mid-50s, he had fallen on hard times, as an inner ear condition that affected his balance made it very difficult for him to get a job. Jobless, Glenn James relied on a local homeless shelter and often panhandled to scrounge together whatever he could to survive. Being homeless isn't easy wherever you are, but the Boston winters were cruel. James suffered. One day, Glenn was in his normal spot outside a Boston area strip mall, hoping for some kindness from strangers. He sat leaning against the building for support and watching the people walk by. It was then he noticed something strange. About 100 yards away, there was a black lump on the ground. Out of habit, he was often on the lookout for any discarded items he might be able to use for himself with his very limited resources. So he approached the bundle, unsure of what to expect. As he got closer, he saw that it was a worn black bag. This was a pretty lucky find. Backpacks can be very useful for the transient lifestyle. However, James had no idea just how lucky he was until he unzipped the bag and saw what was inside. Inside the abandoned backpack, Glenn James found a Chinese passport, some personal items, and a whole bunch of cash. There were many $100 bills, James described to NBC. In total, the bag held $2,400 in cash. In addition to the cash, the bag had an astounding $40,000 in traveler's checks. For a homeless man who was forced to beg for money from strangers, this was a treasure trove. That money could change his life and get him off the streets. There was one thing in the way. Glenn James had morals. Strong ones at that. But the free cash was tempting. Mustering his resolve, James knew exactly what he had to do. He snagged the backpack and took off. Right to the local police station. Officers at the Boston precinct were taken aback when James arrived with a bag of money. He didn't have a penny to his name, but he still did the right thing. And his journey was just the beginning. It turned out that the bag belonged to a Chinese student who was studying in the area and lost track of his belongings. The bag was returned safely and James became a hometown hero. The Boston police decided they needed to do something for James. Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis held a ceremony to honor Glenn James and his superior character and honesty. They gifted him a plaque and televised the event on local news. This is when the story of Glenn James caught the eye of Ethan Whittington. Whittington, who worked at a marketing firm, heard about James and his selfless act. He thought it was wrong that James would simply have to return to the streets after being given a plaque and a handshake. So he decided to do something about it. Following the broadcast of James's story, Whittington established an online fundraiser for the homeless citizen. His goal was to assist James in changing his life, ideally getting him off the streets of Boston. Overnight, the fund became viral. In less than 48 hours, the fundraiser collected $73,000 from over 3,000 donors for Glenn James. The money was sent with messages of praise for James. "Such a beautiful person, reduced me to tears," commented one donor. James was in awe. "I just found James's story to be inspiring," Whittington explained. "We're so inundated with negative news all the time. James gives hope to people and lets them know not all things in the world are bad." The good deed was returned and then some. The fund would total $148,000 for James. When Whittington and James met for the first time in person, they embraced and asked why he returned the money. His response was simple. "Even if I were desperate for money, I would not have kept even a penny," he said. Not to mention, the ever-humble James thanked Whittington repeatedly for starting the fundraiser that would completely change his life. "Thank you. You're the one who deserves the thank you for sure," Whittington replied. Glenn James is one of those rare individuals that restore your faith in humanity. Despite his difficult situation, he was focused on doing the right thing no matter what. His upstanding morals are truly inspiring. The homeless population experiences many hardships that people who have not lived on the streets will never understand. But as evidenced by the story of Glenn James, luck can change in an instant.